Have you ever wondered how Nazi Germany managed to conquer most of Europe in just a matter of weeks? How their soldiers marched for days without sleep, how tank crews drove through enemy lines for 72 hours straight, and how pilots flew mission after mission without showing any signs of exhaustion. The answer isn't superior tactics or better training. It's something far more disturbing. It's a small white pill that turned ordinary men into machines. A pill that would fuel the most devastating military campaign in human history, and eventually contribute to the downfall of the Third Reich itself. This is the story of Pervitin, Nazi Germany's methamphetamine, and how one drug changed the course of World War II. In 1937, a German pharmaceutical company called Temmler-Werke released what they marketed as a harmless energy booster. They called it Pervitin. The advertisements were everywhere, plastered across magazines and newspapers throughout Germany. Housewives were told it would help them get through their daily chores. Students used it to stay awake during late-night study sessions. Factory workers took it to power through long shifts. It was sold over the counter, no prescription needed, and it became wildly popular almost overnight. What most people didn't know was that each little tablet contained 3 milligrams of pure methamphetamine hydrochloride, crystal meth, in pill form, completely legal and available to anyone who walked into a pharmacy. But the civilian market was just the beginning. By 1939, the German military had taken notice of this miracle drug, and they saw something that would change warfare forever. Dr. Otto Ranke, the director of the Research Institute of Defense Physiology, began conducting experiments on university students and soldiers. The results were staggering. Men who took Pervitin could stay awake for days without showing signs of fatigue. They didn't need food. They didn't feel fear. They felt invincible, confident, and ready to fight. Ranke believed he had found Germany's secret weapon, and he was determined to prove it. The first real test came in September 1939 during the invasion of Poland. German soldiers were issued Pervitin as part of their standard rations. The results seemed miraculous. Tank crews operated their vehicles for days without rest. Infantry soldiers marched through the night carrying full combat loads and still had the energy to fight when they reached their objectives. The campaign was over in 28 days, and the world was stunned by the speed and ferocity of the German assault. But this was just a preview of what was coming. By April 1940, Hitler was preparing for the invasion of Western Europe, and he issued what became known as the Stimulant Decree. This order authorized the mass production and distribution of Pervitin to the entire Wehrmacht. The pharmaceutical company Temmler ramped up production to unprecedented levels. In the months leading up to the invasion of France, they manufactured over 35 million tablets. That's enough to supply every German soldier with multiple doses. The drug was distributed like candy, handed out by commanding officers who told their men it would make them unstoppable. On May 10, 1940, the German war machine rolled into France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. What happened next shocked the world. German forces pushed through the Ardennes forest, a region that French military strategists had deemed impossible to cross with tanks. But the Germans didn't just cross it. They tore through it at a pace that defied all military logic. Panzer divisions advanced 22 miles per day, driving through enemy territory without stopping for rest. Tank crews stayed awake for 72 hours straight, their eyes wide, their hands steady on the controls, fueled entirely by methamphetamine. Infantry units marched up to 60 kilometers without a break, and when they finally engaged the enemy, they fought with a ferocity that seemed almost inhuman. The French and British forces were completely overwhelmed. They had expected a long, grinding war similar to World War I. Instead, they faced an enemy that never seemed to sleep, never seemed to tire, and never seemed to stop. Within 6 weeks, France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, and Hitler stood as the master of Western Europe. The Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. And at the heart of that success was a little white pill that kept German soldiers moving when their bodies should have collapsed. But there was a dark side to this chemical warfare, and it didn't take long for the cracks to start showing. Soldiers who had been taking Pervitin for days began to experience horrific side effects. When the drug wore off, the crash was brutal. Men would suddenly collapse in the middle of battle, unable to move, their bodies finally demanding the rest they had been denied. Others became paranoid, seeing enemies that weren't there, hearing voices, experiencing hallucinations that made them a danger to themselves and their comrades. Some soldiers became violently aggressive, turning on their own men in fits of drug-induced rage. Medical reports from the front lines documented cases of complete mental breakdowns, soldiers screaming about invisible attackers, shaking uncontrollably, or falling into catatonic states. By late 1940, German military doctors were starting to realize they had a serious problem on their hands. The drug that had given them such an incredible advantage was now destroying their soldiers from the inside. Reports came in from field hospitals describing young men with the physical symptoms of elderly patients. Hearts damaged from the constant stimulation, nervous systems fried from prolonged use, soldiers in their 20s showing signs of cardiac failure. The Wehrmacht had created an army of addicts, and the consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. But the military leadership didn't stop the program. They couldn't. The war was expanding, and they needed every advantage they could get. When Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Pervitin distribution actually increased. Hitler ordered double the usual supply to be sent to the Eastern Front. Soldiers were taking the drug daily, sometimes multiple times a day, just to cope with the brutal conditions of the Russian campaign. The endless marches, the freezing temperatures, the constant combat, all of it was made bearable only through chemical enhancement. And it wasn't just the regular army that was using Pervitin. The SS, Hitler's elite paramilitary organization, had discovered an even darker application for the drug. Inside the concentration camps, SS guards were using methamphetamine to numb themselves to the atrocities they were committing. The drug didn't just keep them awake and alert, it stripped away their empathy, their humanity, their ability to feel anything at all. Combined with morphine and alcohol, the SS created a chemical cocktail that turned men into emotionless killing machines. Guards could spend hours at the gas chambers, at the execution pits, carrying out mass murder without hesitation, without remorse, because the drugs had disconnected them from reality. There's evidence that suggests some of the worst atrocities of the Holocaust were carried out by men who were completely high on methamphetamine. At camps like Auschwitz, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen, prisoners were also used as test subjects for drug experiments. They were injected with Pervitin and forced to march until their hearts gave out, all in the name of determining how long a human body could survive under extreme conditions while chemically stimulated. The data collected from these horrific experiments was then used to optimize the doses given to combat troops. The camps became laboratories where Nazi science explored the absolute limits of human endurance, and the results were used to make the Wehrmacht more efficient at killing. But perhaps the most shocking drug story of the entire Third Reich involves Adolf Hitler himself. For years, the Führer had been portrayed as a health-conscious vegetarian who abstained from alcohol and tobacco. The reality was far different. Starting in 1936, Hitler came under the care of Dr. Theodor Morell, a physician who would become his personal drug dealer for the next 9 years. Morell was a controversial figure, even among the Nazi leadership. Hermann Göring called him the Reich injection master. Other high-ranking officials referred to him as a quack and tried repeatedly to have him removed. But Hitler trusted Morell completely, and that trust would have devastating consequences. Morell's treatment regimen was extraordinary. He gave Hitler injections multiple times a day, sometimes up to 20 shots in a single 24-hour period. The cocktails contained a staggering array of substances. Vitamins and glucose, yes, but also methamphetamine, cocaine, opioids like Eucadal, which is similar to modern oxycodone, testosterone, and even extracts from animal organs. Hitler was essentially being kept functional through a constant stream of drugs, and as the war progressed, his dependency grew worse. By 1944, Hitler's physical and mental deterioration was obvious to everyone around him. Footage from this period shows him with a visible tremor in his left hand, which he tried to hide by holding it behind his back. His posture was stooped, his face pale and sweaty, his eyes glazed. He would swing wildly between manic energy and complete exhaustion, between grandiose confidence and paranoid rage. His decision-making became increasingly erratic. He refused to listen to his generals, convinced that his intuition was superior to their military expertise. He ordered impossible counteroffensives, refused to allow strategic retreats, and clung to fantasies of secret weapons that would turn the tide of the war. Many historians now believe that Hitler's drug addiction played a significant role in Germany's defeat. His refusal to face reality, his paranoid purges of competent officers, his insistence on holding every inch of ground regardless of the strategic cost, all of these decisions bear the hallmarks of someone whose judgment has been severely impaired by long-term drug abuse. The man who had once been a shrewd political operator had become a trembling addict, making decisions that doomed his own nation. By 1944, the entire German war machine was falling apart, and drugs were a major factor in that collapse. Soldiers who had been taking Pervitin for years were physically and mentally destroyed. Entire units became non-operational not because of enemy action, but because the men were experiencing mass withdrawal symptoms. When supply lines were disrupted and the pills stopped coming, soldiers would go into crisis. Anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, violent outbursts, complete physical collapse. Medical reports from late in the war describe units that were combat ineffective simply because too many men were suffering from the effects of long-term methamphetamine abuse. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, faced similar problems. Pilots who had been flying missions while high on Pervitin were now crashing their planes during routine takeoffs and landings. Their reflexes were shot, their judgment impaired, their bodies worn out from years of chemical stimulation. One fighter squadron in Norway lost 8 aircraft in 3 months, not to enemy fire, but to accidents caused by pilots who were too exhausted and drug-addled to fly safely. As the Allies closed in from both east and west, the Nazi leadership retreated into a bunker beneath Berlin, and even there, the drugs continued. Hitler was still receiving his daily injections from Morell, still clinging to the chemical cocktails that had sustained him for so long. But by April 1945, even Morell's drugs couldn't hide the reality anymore. Germany was defeated, Berlin was surrounded, and the Third Reich was collapsing. On April 21st, Hitler finally dismissed Morell, and for the first time in years, he was forced to face reality without the chemical buffer that had insulated him from the truth. The withdrawal was brutal. Without his daily injections, Hitler deteriorated rapidly. He trembled constantly, could barely walk without assistance, and alternated between rage and complete dissociation. 9 days later, on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life in that bunker, his body ravaged by years of drug abuse, his mind shattered by the collapse of everything he had built. The story of Nazi Germany and methamphetamine is a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to enhance human performance through chemistry. The Germans thought they had found a shortcut to victory, a way to make their soldiers superhuman. Instead, they created an army of addicts whose bodies and minds were destroyed by the very drug that was supposed to make them invincible. The short-term gains of the Blitzkrieg were paid for with long-term devastation. Soldiers who survived the war returned home as broken men, many of them still addicted, many of them suffering from permanent neurological damage. And the legacy of Pervitin didn't end in 1945. After the war, the drug was rebranded and continued to be sold in various forms. In the United States, a similar amphetamine compound was marketed as Obitrol, a weight loss drug that became popular in the 1950s and 60s. That formula was later modified and became what we know today as Adderall, one of the most commonly prescribed medications in America. The chemical descendants of Nazi methamphetamine are now given to millions of children and adults every year, a fact that should give us pause. The Nazis didn't invent drug use in warfare. Soldiers throughout history have used various substances to cope with the horrors of combat. But what made the Nazi program different was the scale and the systematic nature of it. This wasn't soldiers self-medicating to deal with trauma. This was a government deliberately drugging its entire military to turn them into more efficient killing machines. And in doing so, they revealed a dark truth about modern warfare. When you remove the human limitations of fear, exhaustion, and empathy, when you turn soldiers into chemically enhanced machines, you don't create better warriors. You create monsters. The photographs and footage that survive from this era show us the human cost of this experiment. Young men with hollow eyes and trembling hands. Soldiers who look decades older than their actual age. The walking dead kept upright only by the drugs coursing through their veins. These images should serve as a warning about the dangers of trying to chemically optimize human performance, whether in warfare or in everyday life. Today, as we face new questions about performance enhancement, about cognitive drugs, about the ethics of using chemistry to push human capabilities beyond their natural limits, the story of Nazi Germany and Pervitin remains relevant. It reminds us that there are no shortcuts, that every chemical enhancement comes with a cost, and that the price of trying to make humans into machines is ultimately paid in broken bodies and shattered minds. The dark truth about the Nazis on meth is that the drug didn't just fuel their conquests, it contributed to their downfall. It gave them a temporary advantage that they mistook for permanent superiority. And in the end, the little white pill that was supposed to make them invincible became one of the many factors that destroyed them from within. The Third Reich collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions, and methamphetamine was there every step of the way. From the lightning victories of 1940 to the final desperate days in the Berlin bunker. It's a story of how a nation drugged itself into oblivion, and how the pursuit of chemical enhancement led not to triumph, but to total catastrophe.